What if I told you a plane crashed, but some of its passengers kept flying? Seen again at 30,000 feet by people who had no reason to lie. On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 lifted off from New York on what should have been a routine trip to Miami. It became one of the most haunting aviation disasters in American history, and depending on who you believe, the beginning of something even darker, because the crash itself was tragic. But what allegedly happened afterward is what turned Flight 401 into the kind of story conspiracy theorists never forget. It began at JFK Airport in Queens, New York, around 8:30 that evening, when passengers heard the boarding call for Eastern Airlines Flight 401. One by one, 163 passengers and 13 crew members filed onto one of the newest and most advanced passenger aircraft in the world, the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. This was not an ordinary jet. It was enormous, futuristic, and expensive. At the controls sat Captain Bob Loft, a veteran pilot with more than 30,000 hours of flying time. Beside him sat First Officer Bert Stockstill, younger but experienced. A fourth man, Eastern Airlines employee Angelo Donadeo, was also in the cockpit, jump seat, hitching a ride to Miami. By 9:20 p.m., Flight 401 took off into the night. For more than 2 hours, everything about the trip felt normal. At 11:32 p.m., as the aircraft approached Miami, the first sign of trouble appeared. Lowered the landing gear, the crew saw only 2 of the 3 indicator lights illuminate. In a jetliner, that tiny green bulb, without it, they could not be sure the front landing gear was safe for touchdown. The crew's first assumption was simple. The plane was new. The landing gear itself was probably fine. The light bulb had likely burned out. The plane was instructed to leave the approach path and circle over the nearby Everglades while the crew sorted out the problem. 2,000 feet, and the autopilot was engaged. 4 men, all highly trained, all focused on one tiny malfunctioning indicator light. Finally, Captain Loft told flight engineer Don Repo to go down into the hellhole, according to investigators, is when the disaster truly began. It is believed Captain Loft accidentally nudged the control column. The plane did not dive. It did not lurch. It simply began a slow, almost imperceptible descent. No one noticed. Outside, there was no moon and no horizon visible. At 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 slammed into the Florida Everglades at more than 200 miles per hour. On the ground below, a man named Robert Marquis was out in the swamp with a friend in an airboat, searching for frogs. But he turned his airboat toward it and sped across the waterlogged wilderness. When he arrived, he found a nightmare. The plane had broken apart across the swamp. Some passengers were still alive and screaming in the dark. Robert and his friend were the first rescuers on scene. Guided only by a headlamp and the cries of survivors, they waded into the wreckage. By morning, 99 people were dead. 77 survived. Among the dead were Captain Bob Loft, First Officer Bert Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Don Repo. Among the survivors were Angelo Donadeo and Jerry Esky, the man who had written the glowing letter about what a wonderful flight it had been. The official investigation later concluded the crash was caused by human error. The nose landing gear had been functioning properly all along. The problem had simply been a burned-out indicator light bulb. A tiny malfunction, combined with distraction and crew fixation, had destroyed a plane full of people. That should have been the end of the story. But in the years that followed, whispers began to spread through Eastern Airlines. Quietly at first, then repeatedly, then with enough frequency that people started asking a very uncomfortable question. About a month after the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, another Eastern L-1011 was preparing to fly from Newark to Miami when a strange incident reportedly took place. During boarding, a senior flight attendant noticed there was one extra person on board. The man appeared to be an Eastern Airlines captain sitting silently in first class. Assuming he was deadheading, she asked for his name, but he gave no response. Another flight attendant joined her, and then the acting captain came out of the cockpit to handle the situation. When he leaned in to see the man's face, he was stunned. He claimed the silent passenger was Bob Loft, the captain of Flight 401, who had died in the Everglades crash. According to the story, several nearby passengers also saw the man. Then, before anyone could react, he vanished right in front of them. He didn't walk away or hide, he simply disappeared. The flight was delayed while the aircraft was searched from front to back, but no trace of him was found. Reports were allegedly filed, though later those records were said to have disappeared. After that, more sightings followed. Some employees claimed they saw Don Repo, Flight 401's engineer, on other Eastern L-1011s. A catering worker said he saw Repo on a lower deck before the figure vanished. One pilot said he heard noises from the hellhole compartment, only to later see Repo standing in the cockpit before disappearing. Another captain claimed Repo warned him about an engine problem, which mechanics later confirmed.
That detail turned a ghost story into something darker. If true, it suggested the dead were somehow tied to the wreckage itself. Then came the most suspicious part. In 1974, Eastern Airlines quietly removed all salvaged Flight 401 parts from its planes. No public explanation was given. And according to the legend, once those parts were removed, the sightings stopped. Skeptics say it was fear, rumor, and suggestion. But conspiracy theorists point to the witnesses, the vanished reports, and the airline's silence. That's why the story survives. Maybe it was mass hysteria. Or maybe Eastern Airlines knew something it never wanted anyone to know. If you're drawn to stories that blur the line between reality and the unexplained, hit subscribe and turn on notifications.